Similarly, in Earth's spiritual community, people get praise if, for example, they say that they're risen above political division and they love both sides equally. Yet, probably these people have inner parts in themselves who prefer one of the political sides over the other. And that's okay. I too have political preferences. It's not unspiritual to have political preferences. Similarly, in Earth's spiritual community, people get praise if they act like they're always at peace and feeling love for everyone. And if people genuinely feel that way, that's absolutely fantastic. But what happens more often is that people simply suppress parts of themselves that aren't at peace and that don't love everyone. Which is them bulldozing themselves, and frankly in the long term that's less healthy than people just being authentic and just being themselves. Similarly, in Earth's spiritual community, people get praise if they say they believe in and live by certain spiritual principles, such as everything happens for a reason. But then those same people lock their front door, thereby proving that they don't actually believe that everything happens for a reason. In reality, some things indeed are orchestrated by your soul for your highest good, however other things just happen and aren't necessarily happening for your highest good. And people know that on some level, which is why people lock their front door. And yes, there is a divine plan, but it works on a large scale. The divine plan doesn't micromanage everything on a small scale. So basically, a problem with Earth's spiritual community is that the quickest way to get praise and acceptance and status in a partner is to bulldoze parts of yourself and present only the parts of you that seem pure and spiritually advanced. Even though that's unhealthy. People might protest this and say they value authenticity, but it's actually quite hard to sense the impurity in someone who has thoroughly suppressed their so-called unspiritual parts. Which is why you have people absolutely worshipping certain spiritual teachers who then later abuse their followers for money or sex, or who later form cults. Because that's what happens when people suppress parts of themselves. They initially seem great, but then later on their suppressed parts start poking their head through. Though in defense of Earth spiritual teachers, they are in a tough situation because many people in the spiritual community will only listen to people who indeed conform quite closely to the ideal of a spiritual teacher. Therefore, people who want to make a living in the spiritual community are incentivized to suppress parts of themselves that don't fit into the framework of the ideal spiritual teacher. And again, some people will protest this and say that they value authenticity. Now sure, people are different. However, most people only value very specific kinds of authenticity. If a spiritual teacher says that they did bad things during their 20s but now they left that behind and now they're feeling wonderful every day, then people love that kind of authenticity. Or if a spiritual teacher says they were a little nervous just before one of their events started, that may also be fine. However, if a spiritual teacher says that he or she still hasn't fully healed the wounds from their youth despite years of work and still hasn't forgiven their parents, then part of their audience will probably stop listening to them. Same if a spiritual teacher says that they're unable to get over a certain addiction, or if a spiritual teacher says that sometimes they're depressed, or if a spiritual teacher says that sometimes they wonder if their philosophy actually works, or if a spiritual teacher says that they can't stop fantasizing about sex, part of their audience will probably stop listening to them. Hence, people only like certain kinds of authenticity in their spiritual teachers. And sure, there's a good argument to be made that people shouldn't teach before they're ready. I agree with that. But it's also true that if someone who isn't ready to teach just bulldozes the parts of themselves that the audience won't like, then they may be able to make a living in the spiritual field. Hence, the spiritual field incentivizes people to bulldoze parts of themselves. Also, for example, an energy healer or a tarot card reader will get judged and will get less customers if they don't present the image of being a spiritually advanced person who is loving life and who has dealt with all their old pain. Even though you can be a perfectly fine energy healer or tarot card reader while still having old unresolved baggage. Despite all the incentives though, I do recommend being authentic and not suppressing parts of yourself, because in the long term that will make you the happiest and that is what will create the highest quality connections with other people. So, if something arises in you that is supposedly bad according to the spiritual community, I recommend just observing it, and not immediately judging it or trying to suppress it or immediately trying to change it. To be clear though, if for example all parts of you are ready to forgive someone who has wronged you, then it is a very good thing indeed to forgive that person. And if you genuinely love yourself and so do all inner parts of you, then it is completely fine to say that indeed you love yourself. I'm only warning against saying those things if inner parts of you are not on board with that, because then you would be bulldozing those inner parts. If you want something positive in your life, trying to directly go for that thing, such as doing self-love practices, may seem to work or give relief in the short term, but it can bulldoze parts of you that aren't on board with loving yourself. Instead of doing that, I recommend observing what's going on inside you, possibly talking to inner parts of you and accommodating the concerns and needs of those inner parts. Then eventually those inner parts will integrate and genuine self-love will naturally arise. You create self-love not by repeating 1,000 times that you love yourself. Instead you create self-love by dissolving all barriers to love and taking care of all wounded parts of yourself. Therefore, I don't actually suggest repeating I love myself or I love life or I am love or something as a mantra, unless all parts of you are genuinely on board with that. Imagine if you're an unseen inner part of yourself that doesn't love the greater you, and the greater you starts to insist that it loves itself, and the greater part of you suppresses and denies anything that isn't self-love. Wouldn't that make you feel more alone? Conversely, if the greater you takes my suggestion of observing and listening to all parts of itself, then wouldn't that make you feel more loved and more ready to integrate into the whole? Finally, how can you find repressed parts of yourself? Well, whenever you get triggered, or you have a strong emotional reaction or dislike to something without much reason, or you find yourself behaving in a way that doesn't make sense even to yourself, then that may very well point to a repressed part of you. Therefore, getting triggered can actually be quite valuable, because it can point you to a part of you that you may need to observe, accept, and possibly try to accommodate. Anyone who triggers you is in effect a teacher of you, even if they're not doing that consciously. And look, you are already amazing, as you are. There may be some amount of darkness and negativity and pain and perhaps resentment in you, and that's okay. It would be strange if you lived on a world as harsh as Earth and didn't develop at least some of those feelings. You're amazing as you are, even with possible negativity and pain and unresolved wounds and all. It's okay to be yourself, it really is. And even if there's some amount of darkness and pain in you, you're still good enough. You are. You always have been and you always will be good enough. With that and with all my love, I wish you a very good week. Your star sister, Tunia.